Welcome to the West Wing Week, your guide to everything that's happening at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. This week, the president talked about an important policy change on immigration that more closely aligns our policy with our values, and traveled to the Group of 20 summit in Los Cabos, Mexico, to work towards stabilization of the global economy. That's June 15th to June 21st, or Dreamers. Friday afternoon, the president stood on the Rose Garden steps and discussed steps his administration is taking to defer action against young people who are low enforcement priorities, making the nation's immigration enforcement policy more just and more efficient.
This morning, Secretary Napolitano announced new actions my administration will take to mend our nation's immigration policy, to make it more fair, more efficient, and more just, specifically for certain young people, sometimes called dreamers. The Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people.
Just outside the gates of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, an emotional crowd gathered to express their support for the administration's announcement. To further explain what this means, we put Cecilia Munoz on the clock. So Cecilia, you have 60 seconds or less when you're ready.
Last week, the Department of Homeland Security announced that for young people who are under the age of 30, came to the U.S. before the age of 16, and have been in the country 5 years and don't pose any kind of security risk, that they'll be able to come forward and ask the agency for deferred action, which lifts from them the shadow of the deportation process and allows them to come forward and ask for work authorization. This is important because it'll give these young people the ability to contribute fully to this country, which is their country. The President believes they shouldn't be punished for the actions of their parents and should have every opportunity to contribute. This isn't a permanent solution, and these young people deserve certainty. That's why the administration is going to continue to push for the DREAM Act, continue to push for a broader immigration reform, because it's good for the country, it's good for the economy, and because it's the right thing to do.
Later, at the annual LGBT Pride Month reception in the East Room of the White House, the president addressed an enthusiastic crowd and highlighted steps his administration has taken to honor the civil rights of all Americans. On Sunday, the president traveled to the G20 summit south of the border in Mexico. Let's get with our guide to the proceedings, Jay Carney, on board Air Force One.
The G20 is where leaders gather to discuss global economic events, global economic policy, and issues that are confronting the most powerful economic countries in the world.
On Monday, the president met with the summit's host, Mexican President Felipe Calderón, to discuss a range of issues, including Mexico joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. He then sat down with newly elected President Putin of Russia. Since this was only their second meeting ever, and the first since President Putin took office, they had a lot to talk about. In fact, the meeting lasted about twice as long as originally scheduled. Then the official G20 summit began. The seventh summit of the G20 nations includes 19 country members and the European Union, which together represent approximately 90% of global GDP, 80% of global trade, and nearly 70% of the world's population. On the second day of the summit, the president wrapped up his stay in Mexico with a bilateral meeting with President Hu of China, their 12th to date, and then held a news conference before making his way north back to Washington, D.C. And Jay, how about a wrap-up?
G20 summit focuses on economic issues, and the number one economic issue in the world right now is the Eurozone crisis. That was probably the number one topic of conversation in all the meetings that the president had, both with all the leaders of the G20 and then in sidebar meetings with European leaders and other leaders like the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to focus on this issue of what steps the Europeans are taking to deal with the crisis that they face right now. That was the number one issue, and it was as the meetings convened, we learned that the elections in Greece had turned out relatively favorably, given the volatile situation there, and that was certainly helpful.
On Thursday, the president held a conference call with students on student loans.
Thank you.
And then spoke in the East Room on the need to urge Congress to prevent student loan interest rates from doubling on July 1st.
Use the hashtag, don't double my rate. Don't double my rate.
That evening, cabinet secretaries took the court with some WNBA stars and local women's college basketball players for an honorary game of hoops in celebration of Saturday's upcoming anniversary of Title IX. To find out more information on any of these topics or to see complete videos of these events, go to whitehouse.gov. And thanks again for checking out your West Wing Week.
Todo o povo brasileiro.
Yes, perfect.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to make a fool of myself. I'll be your fault.
I'll take that.